And the search continues for two toddlers from California City, 3 and 4-year-olds Orrin and Orson West, who are on your screen right now. They were reported missing around 5 p.m. yesterday.
It was December 21st, 2020, 5:45 p.m. when Cal City Police Department responded to a 911 call from Trezell West. His two adopted children, Orrin 4 and Orson age 3, had allegedly disappeared from the backyard. Cal City Police kicked into action, searching the streets for the missing boys before turning their attention to the West family. Jacqueline and Trezell were the parents of 6 young boys, 2 biological and 4 they gained from fostering to adoption. Orrin and Orson were the youngest of the brood. Their biological parents had lost custody after one of the boys acquired an injury. Despite receiving medical treatment, CPS deemed it appropriate to take the boys into care, where they'd be fostered by the Wests. Eventually, a judge decided the children were not to be returned to their family, and the Wests applied for and gained the right of adoption. They legally changed the boys' names from Classic and Cecile Pettus to Orrin and Orson West. When a family decides to become foster parents, they should be subjected to rigorous checks. This includes thorough background checks, psychological and home checks. Once granted the right to foster, then the children within their care should be provided with regular health and dental visits and have a set allowance for clothing. Foster parents have to interact with multiple agencies regularly, including facilitating contact with the biological parents of the children. Fostering is often only a temporary step because family reunification is usually the ultimate goal. In the case of the West, it appears they're able to adopt 4 children from the state. These children were introduced as foster children, monitored frequently before proceeding to adoption, which can take anywhere from 6 months to 18 months to finalise. Somewhere down the line, the West ticked all the boxes to be suitable parents 4 times in total. Back to December 2020. It's standard procedure to search the home of the missing children, interview the parents and any children in the home. Abductions are extremely rare, but every avenue has to be thoroughly investigated. At the time of the disappearance, the thought of the children was staying with their grandma in Bakersfield. It hasn't been disclosed who that relative was. Both parents were the only people at the home at the time of the disappearance. So now, we have to jump forward in time to the 3rd of March 2022. Both Trezell and Jacqueline are in Bakersfield Court for an arraignment hearing, where they are charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder for Orrin and Orson West, 2 counts of cruelty to a child, and 1 count of making a false emergency call. They both plead not guilty and are being represented by lawyers from the indigent defence panel. The couple are accused of murdering Orrin and Orson by the 2nd degree. This is kind of confusing, as being accused of murdering children sounds like it should be 1st degree, but to attempt to simplify this, it basically means that the murders were not a premeditated or pre-planned act. To complicate matters, the bodies of the children have not been located, and a time of death estimated at around September the 1st, 2020, so prosecutors have had to tie the offence to the couple without the physical evidence of injury. The district attorney used what is known as a grand jury to apply the charges. A grand jury is much like the jury of a trial. Up to 23 people of the community are selected to take a seat in a courtroom. The proceedings are held in total secrecy, with only the jury, a court reporter and a prosecutor. Each witness that's called to testify has no legal representative with them and is not cross-examined in any way. Their statements are not challenged. Once the proceedings are completed, the jury, with legal guidance from the prosecution, has to decide if the evidence presented warrants the charges. So in the case of the Wests, the grand jury agreed upon the charges and they were subsequently arrested. It's unclear why the district attorney chose this method, as in a press conference held shortly after the Wests were arrested, she stipulated that direct evidence of their crime exists. These charges could have been filed with a standard proceeding with a preliminary hearing. This type of hearing is where the prosecution has to provide sufficient evidence for there to be a criminal trial to the court. A request by the prosecution to place a gag order on the investigation documents has been granted. The defence are in agreement with this. This now prevents any details about the investigation being made public. It helps with the trial proceedings if little is known about the investigation to prevent any bias during jury selection for the upcoming trial of the Wests. So now we can go back to December 2020 when the boys were reported missing. Now we know that West have been charged with making a false 911 call, and we can begin to understand a little more about the case. The boys were never at the home in Cal City, but how quickly officers figured this out is unclear. The canines brought in to search for the boys were given items relating to them to track their scent. As Cal City's chief stated, the scent never left the home.
You had the dogs in the house. That night they alerted inside the house, but they didn't alert outside.
But if the boys were never there, then whose scent were they tracking? When FBI came to search the home, they took items for DNA purposes, but whose DNA did they get? Were there 6 beds in the 3-bedroomed home? Did the West set up an extra set of beds to fool the police? What was on the phones that the FBI seized from the couple? We know that following the 911 call, the remaining children were taken by CPS and have not been since returned to them. CPS have a case against the West for child support. Obviously, the law is extremely strict around information relating to the children, but to be removed by the CPS shows they were in some way at risk or in danger. So it was a little peculiar when Trezell West's mother posted this statement through the website Medium, claiming the boys were under the protection of the FBI. 1st of March 2021, with no new information publicly released, Sergeant Robert Parr of Bakersfield PD announces that they've now taken lead on the case. He cites that the West family, having previously lived in Casa Loma apartments in Bakersfield and having ties to the area, makes it more logical that they take over the case. Just days later, Bakersfield police, alongside the FBI, conduct a large-scale search on land surrounding the very apartments the West had previously lived before moving to the Cal City home. 3 months into the disappearance, it's clear that law enforcement agencies knew what they were looking for. They were looking for the remains of the boys, and they had sufficient evidence to suspect the West of foul play. With a plea for anyone who had seen or interacted with Orrin and Orson in the past 12 months also confirmed that they were looking for more evidence. I suspect they found it because the district attorney announced that 50 witnesses were called to the grand jury hearing. This places the boys last been seen alive in Bakersfield where the West resided in the Casa Loma apartments. So to clarify, the next move the West made was purchasing the Cal City home and moving there in September. If the evidence is correct, the boys were murdered, disposed of in some way, then the family packed up and moved to their newly purchased home. Pretty brazen manoeuvres, considering they have 4 young children that could drop them in it at any time. And on top of that, how on earth did they hide Orrin and Orson's disappearance from their respective families? When you fast forward to December, when the other children were with Grandma, did anyone not question where the 2 youngest boys were? And that's maybe what prompted the West to fake a disappearance with the Christmas holidays approaching. People were surely going to expect to see Orrin and Orson or ask where they were. It's taken over a year to press charges against the couple, which makes you wonder how strong the evidence against them actually is. The indictment against the West couple is pretty damning. Alongside the second-degree murder charges, the prosecution has added 4 aggravating factors. They range from acts of violence, the vulnerability of the victims being children, abuse of a position of trust, and inducing others to participate with the crime. The prosecution has to provide sufficient evidence to support these factors, but in general these factors are intended to increase the penalty sentence. The couple face 15 years to life for each count of second-degree murder. With the aggravating factors taken into account, this pushes for a whole life sentence.
I went up to that gate, I'm throwing wood, bringing it inside the house. My wife's inside. She was actually wrapping gifts, so we thought it was a good idea that our youngest two go outside and play with chalk on the back patio.
I feel like they did something and they know something. They did something.
He thinks you guys did something.
And that's understandable.
What's your response to that?
That's understandable. I would think the same thing.
Yep.
I mean, that's exactly the point. And if we can find our babies, then guess what? That's no.
The odds are certainly stacked against this couple. They make the worst public plea for the boys, immediately casting suspicion upon them, and then vanished from the public eye, left their home in Cal City and lived under the radar right up until March, where they were arrested heading out of Bakersfield in a camper van. It makes me wonder if they got a tip-off that the charges were pending. This case throws up so many questions. How were they able to foster and adopt? How could they fool so many people? What was happening with the other children? Was there abuse happening in the home? Why were Orrin and Orson targeted? They were just defenceless toddlers. This happened during the pandemic. Was the stress of lockdowns too much for the Wests? Orrin and Orson's biological father is seeking a civil case against Kern County for their failure to protect his children. As for the Wests, after being denied bond, they have to sit in jail and await the mere trial. Their defence team has just 2 months to prepare for what is going to be a very interesting trial. How can the West family explain the disappearance of the boys and their false 911 call without implicating themselves? This case is going to weigh heavily on evidence that the prosecution has. Orrin and Orson were just 3 and 4 years old. It's truly heartbreaking that we lose their lives to the people who were tasked with providing them a safe, happy home.